Well, hello, future instructional designers. Shawntay Skjoldager here, back for another week of our Accelerated ID series. So in our Accelerated ID session today, we're going to explore the differences between learning objectives, learning outcomes, and terminal objectives. We're going to review some examples of each of those, and then we're going to talk about some do's and don'ts. All right. Okay. So what is the difference between these things? Now, it's really terminal objectives, that's pretty easy to see the difference between them, but where it gets confusing, even for seasoned instructional designers like me, is when you get into the learning objective versus the learning outcome. And the reason that it gets confusing is because they're almost written the same, but it's really the lens that you're looking through that is different. So we're going to talk about the different lenses that you look through. So we're going to go ahead and jump into these and we'll get started. So your terminal objective, this is really like the overarching objective of a program. So let's say that you are enrolled in a course, and in that course, there are multiple modules. Let's say there's 10 different modules, right? So a terminal objective would be that overarching objective that applies to all of those modules. So by the time you finish all of these modules, the terminal objective is the thing that is achieved, right? So here you can see on the screen that we're defining a terminal objective as the overarching goal or outcome of an entire program. So it's like your program goal. Then we jump into learning objectives. So these are statements about what the learner should be able to do or know by the end of that learning experience, okay? It's specific, it's measurable, it's observable. And then you get into learning outcomes. So this really describes what the learner has learned or is expected to learn or can demonstrate that they learned. So whenever you read the definitions, you're like, okay, I've got that. That seems pretty easy to understand. So the learning objective is what they should be able to do, and the outcome is what they are expected to do or be able to demonstrate. Where it gets confusing is that they're written pretty much the same. So it's hard to distinguish between them. So here are some examples of objectives. So again, our terminal objective is overarching, right? So it's like the thing that rises above all of those modules. It's the goal of that entire learning experience when there are multiple components of that experience. So in this example, we see that by the end of this program, the learner will be able to design and implement a comprehensive marketing plan for a new product launch, including market research, product positioning, pricing strategy, and promotional tactics, right? That's a really big objective. In fact, you could take each of those pieces and turn them into separate learning objectives or learning outcomes for each of the different modules. So it's something that's really broad. It encompasses a lot, and then you could further niche it down within the program. Now you get into your learning objective. Again, when you look at learning objective and you look at learning outcome, this is like where it's hard to tell what it is. So the learning objective example that we have here is, given a set of customer complaints, the learner will be able to identify the underlying causes of the complaints to address them. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. So we're saying that this is what we expect them to learn. Now, here is the nuance here. If you look up underneath learning objective, you can see that I've written ID/facilitator perspective. So you're looking through the lens of the instructional designer or the facilitator who is either developing or delivering this. This is like our guide of where we're trying to get that learner. So that's really what our objective is. It's like that destination that we're trying to move people towards. Then when we get into our learning example or learning outcome example, we can see that upon completion of this workshop, the learner will be able to use effective communication strategies to resolve conflicts in the workplace. Now we're looking through the lens of the learner. So by the time this workshop is over, this is what I should be able to do. So the real difference, the real nuance is, like, The starting point is the learning objective, is what we expect them to learn. And the ending point is the learning outcome. It's what we expect them to be able to do. Now, as instructional designers, as facilitators, as teachers, as faculty, it's very common for us to use these terms interchangeably, even though there are nuanced differences between them. So my goal for today is to introduce you to the differences, show you some examples, give you some tips on how to set up a learning objective or outcome. And then you're equipped with knowledge, and however you want to use them moving forward is up to you. You can still continue to use them interchangeably, or you can look at them as different and apply that. Okay. All right. So terminal objective, again, just to highlight that this is overarching and it's that very broad statement. And our learning objective, this is where it's from the lens of the teacher, from the lens of the facilitator, from the lens of the instructional designer who is creating the learning experience. I often associate learning objectives with lighthouses. Just like the lighthouse, it was meant to help guide the ships to safety, right? Our learning objectives are designed to guide the learning experience and guide where we want to take the learner. And then that learning outcome, that's like hitting the shore, right? Or docking in the bay, wherever the ships actually landed. So that means that they actually got to that destination successfully. All right, so just to recap, learning objectives describe what the learner will be able to achieve or do during the learning experience from the perspective of the instructional designer who is creating that learning experience, or from the perspective of the facilitator or the teacher who is leading that learning experience. The learning outcome describes what they should be able to demonstrate that they can do after that training, right? That word outcome, right? What was the outcome of that? Well, the learner is able to do X, Y, Z. Learning objective. The objective of this entire learning experience is that the learner will learn how to do X, Y, Z, or will be able to do X, Y, Z. Okay. All right. So here are some common formatting tips. So we always want to start with an action verb. We want to use a present tense action verb. So we want to use identify, explain, solve, discuss, create, synthesize, summarize, right? We want to use present tense. Then we want to add the what. So we have that action verb plus what we want them to do. So if we want them to create plus what we want them to do, a business plan, solve equations, mathematical equations, explain the difference between learning objectives and learning outcomes, right? So you give that present tense verb and you give the what. And if you want to take it a little bit further, then you can add some additional criteria or conditions to help clarify it even more. So in this case, we've got identify key components of a business plan, and then we're adding some additional criteria, including the executive summary, including the marketing analysis. Or the other example here is solve the what? Linear equations. And then the extra conditions are with no outside assistance. We could use like Microsoft Excel. They should be able to create formulas using the shortcut key, something like that. So these are the examples. Now, in our program, in our Instructional Design and Tech Accelerator program, it's always one of the challenging parts is creating learning objectives, because we want to make them all over the place. There might be, you always want to start an objective or all of your objectives the same. So it's always starts with a present tense vocabulary or a present tense verb. So if you have 3 objectives, it's going to start with a present tense verb, a present tense verb, and a present tense verb. So those are just things to keep an eye on. Always consistent. By the way, this is also true for your resume. Whenever you go to work on your resume, you're always either going to start with a present tense verb, or if it's a past job, you would use a past tense verb. Okay, so now let's talk about some things that you want to avoid whenever you are creating your learning objectives and your learning outcomes. You want to avoid vague language, right? Because we need our objectives and our outcomes to be both measurable and observable. So we want to avoid anything vague or anything that is ambiguous. So here we have an example that we want to avoid, that we don't want to create as instructional designers. Participants will understand the topic. So this is super vague, right? We're not saying what we want them to understand about the topic. And even the word understand is really kind of subjective, right? You can't really quantify what that understanding is. You know, it takes something else to make sure that there is actually understanding of that content. So understand by itself is vague. And then whenever we just use like something general, like a topic, and we don't get specific about that topic, then it's very, very loose. So we want to have things that are more specific. Also, we want to avoid verbs that are difficult to observe. So kind of like what we just talked about, but here are some additional examples. So verbs that we shy away from whenever we're creating our learning experiences are understand, learn, appreciate, know, become familiar with. And raise your hand if you have seen these or even use these. And there's no judgment. We have all used them. But these are difficult to observe. So instead of learn or appreciate, and I should have put define on here as well. That's another one that we don't typically want to bring into our learning experiences because they're not really action oriented and they're hard to observe. And they're not really specific, right? They're kind of general. And so we tend to shy away from these. Now, here's another one. This is one that I see people use a lot. In fact, whenever I look at textbooks, college textbooks, you know, oftentimes at the beginning of a chapter, there will be some objectives, and they're often what we call double-barreled objectives or outcomes. We don't want double-barreled. And what I mean by double-barreled is that there are two action verbs. We only want one action verb per objective or outcome. So here, the example to avoid is where we have identify and describe the components of a business plan. So what I want your attention on here is, think about it this way. You don't need identify and describe. You may want the students to be able to identify, but the fact that they can describe implies that they can identify. So we don't really need to have both of these action verbs. So we could drop identify and just begin with describe the components of a business plan. If I can describe them, then the odds are pretty high that I can also identify them. All right. So here's a little pop quiz for us to practice. What do you think? Is this a well-written learning objective? What do you think? Now, we didn't do anything complicated, but here it is. By the end of this lesson, learners will be able to identify the key features and benefits of the ABC software. Yes, the reason that this is a decent objective is because we do say, remember, it's an objective. An objective is written from the lens of the instructional designer and from the facilitator to help guide that learning experience. So it's well written because it's specific and it's measurable. So I can measure, I can observe whether or not they can identify the key features and the benefits. And I have that extra criteria of the new ABC software. So I had the action verb, I had the what, and then I had the additional criteria. The additional criteria are not required. At minimum, I have to have present tense action verb and the what that I want them to do. So is this a well-written learning objective? Understand the new product features. This is not a great objective because it's vague, it lacks clarity. It says new product features, but we're not getting anything specific. There are no additional criteria, even though those additional criteria aren't required. But we're starting with that really low level verb that is hard for us to assess, right? Very good. So we need the measurement, and we need that strong, that specific, stronger action verb. All right, so here is a learning outcome, right? Written from the lens of the learner. After completing this lesson, the learner will be able to use Microsoft Excel to create basic spreadsheets that include common calculations with at least 90% accuracy. Yes, this is an example of a good learning outcome. As instructional designers, it's very common for us to use objective and outcome interchangeably. Whenever you look at them on paper or on the screen, they're written very close to the same way, right? You're still explaining what you expect of the learners, but it really is just looking at it through the lens of who is it, someone that's guiding the experience, or is it someone that's on the receiving end of that experience? So the person that's guiding the experience, the instructional designer who's creating it, the facilitator who's leading it, that's when we fall on the side of objective. And then on the other side, from the student perspective, that's on the side of the learning outcome. Does every lesson need to have all three? No. And you might only have one for everything, right? You very rarely hear people talk about terminal objectives, but as instructional designers or future instructional designers, it's always good for us to know what's right. And then we adopt whatever language people are using in the workplace. It's not about being right so much as it is about having the understanding of what is right, and then help guiding the people that we are working with to do the right things. My experienced instructional designers that are here with us, if you're listening right now, this will resonate with them. Whenever we are learning to become an instructional designer, we learn all the right things, right? Or I shouldn't say we learn all the right things, but we learn a lot of the right things. And then whenever we sit down to create our first learning experience with our subject matter expert or our business owner, like, we're sitting down with all the best practices, knowing like, this is how you create an engaging learning experience. This is how you create an objective. This is how you create an outcome. And what we often run into is that while we know best practices, while we know what the right thing to do is, the person that we are working with doesn't have that knowledge. So then it becomes about taking them where they are and guiding them as far as we can to get them as close to right as possible. Sometimes, we don't get very far because people are convinced that they have the right way of doing things. And then over time, as we build our credibility, we get closer and closer to that right thing. So that was a really good question. No, you do not need to have all three objectives. You may only go with one. You may use learning objective interchangeably and just put that across everything. But I just wanted to make sure that you were equipped with the knowledge of the terminal objective is an overarching goal. The learning objective is what we, as the creators of learning experiences, want our learners to learn. And then the learning outcome is what we expect of the learners to have learned or be able to demonstrate. We do have more information about objectives. There's an objective formula and everything inside of our instructional design kit. So if anybody wants that, you can go to acceleratedid.com/kit. It's a free kit. Put in your email, you get the kit, and that is that. So it's been fun, my friends, and I will see you soon. Bye.